Do you really know the people closest to you? Can you spot a liar, a manipulator, someone who's genuinely invested in your well-being? Think again. The most familiar faces often wear the most convincing masks. That voice you find comforting might be subtly silencing your true self. Those deep bonds? They can be invisible chains forged in unresolved trauma, projections, and unconscious bargains. Most connections aren't between two people, but two mental constructs, internal images we project onto each other. You don't relate to the other person, but to your unconscious mind's interpretation of them. This isn't just poetic, it's a dangerous reality. Carl Jung called it projection, a subconscious distortion, making us see our own forgotten fragments, our shadows, pasted onto others. Picture a woman who suppressed her anger as a child, swallowing screams, tolerating abuse, stifling desires. As an adult, she inexplicably gravitates toward controlling men, mistaking their dominance for love. It's an archetypal dance of repression. She seeks out the externalized anger she never dared feel, their mask a stage for her silenced inner turmoil, the chilling detail. By projecting what we refuse to see in ourselves, we block our own healing. We fail to acknowledge that anger, that fear, that neediness, it's ours. And instead of confronting it, we try to control the other person, blaming them for our inner turmoil. Jung said what remains unconscious governs our lives, and we call it fate. Repeated patterns of suffering, abusive relationships, betrayals. It's not bad luck. It's the unconscious screaming for attention. How often have you asked, why do I always end up with these people? Why are my friendships so draining? Why am I lonely surrounded by others? Because you're dancing with your own shadows disguised as people. The shadow encompasses everything we deny. Impulses deemed ugly, desires deemed wrong, emotions we haven't learned to feel without guilt. But it doesn't vanish. It hides. And in hiding, it finds subtle, dangerous ways to manifest. In relationships, dreams, illness, addiction, silences, and explosions. The irony? The more we deny our shadow, the more we attract people who reflect it and not kindly. They become distorted mirrors, reflecting back our deepest fears with a cruel accuracy. Toxic relationships don't start with a toxic other. They begin with our unconscious yearning to be seen, heard, acknowledged, through pain. Consider the last relationship that wounded you. What did that person constantly make you feel? Rejected? Insecure? Controlled? Inferior? Now reverse the question. When have you rejected, controlled, or felt inferior yourself? The path to understanding begins to open. Often others don't directly manipulate us. They infiltrate pre-existing psychic spaces with surgical precision, knowing exactly what to say to trigger old wounds. We unconsciously choose people who reconnect us with original pain, the first abandonment, the first shame, the first repression. We call it fate. We call it love. It's repetition compulsion, a concept Freud explored, Jung deepened. It's the unconscious need to relive unresolved pain, hoping for resolution. Without self-awareness, all we get is more pain and less understanding. Relationships built on projection are unsustainable. The other person's mask eventually falls off, or worse, our own mask suffocates us, revealing self-denial, self-molding, self-abandonment. Collapse ensues. The false self must crumble for the true self to be reborn. Self-awareness isn't a luxury, it's emotional survival. Only by diving into your unconscious can you break the cycle of repetition. Only by facing your shadow with courage can you stop fighting the shadow in others. Only by removing the mask of control can you breathe authenticity. Jung's individuation is this: reconciling with all parts of the psyche, even the terrifying ones. It's not about perfection, it's about wholeness. And wholeness doesn't come from avoiding pain, it comes from walking through it. Have you noticed how someone can dominate without raising their voice? How certain people become the center of your emotional universe without you realizing you're orbiting them? It's not magic or charisma, it's manipulation, so subtle, so psychological. It often masquerades as care, love, presence. These relationships are dangerous not for overt violence, but for psychic colonization. Gradually, the other person invades your inner space, makes decisions for you without orders, makes you doubt your perceptions, and installs themselves as a symbolic figure, an archetype. The saving mother, the hero, the master, the sufferer, the martyr. Each of these unconscious roles takes root and commands your emotions. This is how toxic bonds form, not as physical prisons, but symbolic ones. Imagine a young man who always had to please to be accepted, who only heard, "I love you," as a reward for good grades. He learned that love is conditional. As an adult, he seeks validation through self-sacrifice. He calls it an intense relationship. It's emotional slavery. Why doesn't he see it? Because it activates a psychic memory. This pattern feels familiar, safe. The repetition begins. The most destructive relationships often appear the most affectionate. Manipulation doesn't shout. It whispers sweetly. This whisper mimics empathy, but it's invasion. It looks like love, but it's possession. It resembles concern, but it's control. Unconscious manipulation uses sophisticated masks. The indispensable savior, the fragile victim who evokes guilt, the infantilizing mentor. These characters exist within us symbolically and activate when our identities are undefined. When you don't know who you are, anyone can define you. That's why some people are magnets for toxic relationships, not because they deserve to suffer, but because they haven't recognized the unconscious mechanisms driving them. The quest isn't for love, it's for symbolic repetition. This breaks only with self-awareness. Jung said the persona, the social mask we wear, becomes a prison when we forget it's a role. When we confuse persona with identity, we're vulnerable to anyone who praises or criticizes that role. We live to maintain the image, even if it suffocates us. Relationships become webs, each person validating their mask through the other, hoping for recognition in a role they may no longer desire. Authenticity dies, leaving only emotional theatrics. That feeling of being with someone yet lonelier than ever? That's the soul crying out for truth. The truth emerges when we stop asking, "What does the other person want from me?" and start asking, "Who am I without them?" The answer can be terrifying. Often, without the other, we don't know who we are. This is the beginning of the journey back to self. True emotional freedom comes when we see ourselves beyond the other's gaze, when our actions become conscious choices, not reactions to old traumas. When we stop projecting the severe father onto the boss, the negligent mother onto the partner, the aggressive sibling onto friends. When we finally say, "This is mine and I need to take care of it." It's not about blaming others, but reclaiming what we've projected. This is the beginning of healing. If you've come this far, this resonates deeply. Subscribe to this channel, not out of habit, but because something within you stirred. We speak not to algorithms, but to souls. Share in the comments. What was the most enigmatic, intense, or confusing relationship of your life? What did it teach you about boundaries, projections, or your true self? Write as much or as little as you like. Use a pseudonym if you prefer. Share because self-expression is liberation, and someone reading might find their own freedom. At some point in understanding your unconscious, everything seems to crumble. We're not just victims, we're accomplices. We realize the pain we feel was built with our own hands, with the bricks of denial, repression, and self-deception. This is when the shadow begins to reveal itself. It doesn't appear with horns and red eyes. It emerges in the details: envy of a friend's success, rage when someone points out our weakness, automatic disdain for those who live differently. The shadow lives in disproportionate reactions, in impulses we can't control. Jung said, "What we don't bring to consciousness creates our destiny. The shadow you don't integrate, you project. It will appear with a face, a voice, a name. It manifests in relationships, poor choices, repeated self-sabotage. That type of person you always attract despite trying to change. That, 'Why does this always happen to me?' feeling. Often it's not bad luck, it's a symbolic cycle, the unconscious saying, 'It's not over, you haven't learned yet.' The cruelty is that these projections often masquerade as passion. When we project our shadow, we feel an inexplicable magnetic connection. Our repressed side seeks union with something external. This isn't true union, it's mirroring. As long as we believe the other is the problem, we remain blind to the fact that we're relating to parts of ourselves we don't understand. The external. Person is the mirror. The content is ours. After years in a toxic relationship, it's common to say, "I don't recognize myself anymore." That's wrong. The correct statement is, "I'm finally starting to recognize myself." Intense relationships, emotional shocks, symbolic bonds, they're painful, but they're also the unconscious asking for attention, not as punishment, but as opportunity. Trauma isn't a death sentence, it's an opening for change if faced courageously. There are risks. Treading into the unconscious is dangerous. You might get lost in memories, guilt, illusions, but the greater danger is pretending. Everything is fine. Pretending you're in control when an old emotional complex is calling the shots. These complexes have their own logic, desires, and usually ignore your conscious will. You might spend years blaming others for your relationship failures before realizing it's not bad luck. It's a pattern. A pattern is a symptom of a soul crying out for attention. The path of individuation reveals itself, not as a manual but a direction. Integrate what's been separated. Acknowledge the exiled forces within you, anger, desire, sadness, freedom, and that they are trying to return. They return as symptoms. Crises, destructive relationships, but the purpose is the same, to awaken you. True healing doesn't come from changing the other. It comes from looking in the mirror and saying, "I am this too. I am light and shadow. I am control and vulnerability. I am human." Then everything changes. When you accept yourself completely, no one can use you as incomplete. Notice how some people, upon awakening, stop attracting certain relationships. It's not magic. It's internal congruence. When you no longer need to play a role to be loved, you stop attracting people who only love you for that role. Manipulation loses its power against authenticity. The prison of the persona crumbles when you confront it and say, "Thank you for protecting me, but I can live without masks now." It's not easy. It hurts. You'll relinquish the false self that was loved. You'll lose connections, status, maybe even affection. But what follows is real freedom. And with freedom comes responsibility. Emotional freedom isn't living without pain. It's choosing who and why you suffer. The final stage isn't grand. Don't expect applause or enlightenment. When awakening begins, there are no fireworks, there's silence. A silence so deep it's frightening. Because you've finally stopped reacting, you've learned to observe. In that silence lies something rare, the beginning of true freedom. The persona begins to fall, and consequences follow. The world doesn't. Immediately understand who you're becoming. Some people distance themselves, others try to force you back. Doubt arises. Am I doing this right? Yes. Only those who cross this inner desert discover the oasis of authenticity. It's not at the end of the journey. It's in the act of walking consciously. Authenticity isn't about speaking your mind or honesty at all costs. That's the ego reacting. Authenticity is perceiving your own psychic movements. When part of you wants to scream, but another says, "Wait, where does this come from?" You realize you're not your anger, your desire for revenge, your fear of rejection. These are aspects, not your essence. When you stop blindly identifying with these impulses, they lose their power to control you. You don't eliminate the shadow. You learn to dance with it. This dance between light and darkness forms the complete human being, not perfect, but conscious. Someone who can say no firmly and yes truthfully, who can love without self-annihilation, who can lose without self-destruction. Relationships transform. You no longer seek completion in others, but sharing. You no longer tolerate subtle manipulations disguised as affection. Your internal compass is calibrated. When you meet someone who's also traversed this path, the bond is different. Not a game of masks, but a meeting of souls. There's more silence, less demand, more presence. Perhaps the greatest reward is serenity. Knowing that even when everything crumbles, you are there, whole, awake, present. After the labyrinths, you see meaning in what you've lived. The pain, loss, shattered mirrors, each fragment builds a larger mosaic, a map of yourself. Not a map to safety, but one reminding you who you are when everything falls apart. If this video touched you, made you rethink something, or even gave you positive discomfort, subscribe. Not out of habit, but because you'll find more people like you here. Those who feel deeply, who seek meaning, who aren't afraid to dive into their own abyss. We're building a community that welcomes, listens, and shares. You're welcome here. Share your story in the comments. Tell us what resonated most, what you learned. Or simply write, "I see the shadow too." That says a lot. We'll listen. You're not alone.